Wonderful. All right. So as advertised, I am going to be discussing impacts of fire, a particular wildfire, on reptiles and amphibians in Sonoma County. There are going to be three components to what I'm going to tell you today. First, we're going to talk about the background of how we previously understood how fire and herps, and that's one of many terms that I'm going to be introducing to you during that component, how the interaction of those two has been previously understood. And I'm going to discuss the history of this particular study, which has sort of an interesting path that brought us to where we are today and where it continues to go. And then I'm going to reflect on what we have learned so far based on our analyses of the first few years of this study. In particular, what we've learned with respect to how wildfire can impact certain species within this study site. So to begin with, herpetofauna, or herps for short, has a particular definition. As terms go, they are quite an enjoyable thing to enter into your phone and enjoy the response that your autocorrect will have. It's not a child-friendly activity, but I do encourage you to do that. Hopefully, the algorithms will begin to understand these terms themselves. So herpetofauna is a term that is a blanket term that refers to both amphibians and reptiles. Those two lineages are not directly related in a really evolutionary standpoint. So this blanket term is more of a functional understanding of groups that tend to cohabitate and we like to study in concert with each other. So amphibians, of course, includes frogs, or more specifically, anurans. So you can see some of our local examples up here at the top of the screen. We can see our Sierra tree frogs and our western toads, of course. Then salamanders, which is another blanket term, which includes both salamanders, as you see here on the left, and then also newts, so sort of the lunged salamander capacity. So that's going to be our amphibians. And then for reptiles, reptiles is another term that's a little bit of a misnomer in that it groups species that don't necessarily have perfectly shared lineages, and I'm actually going to be breaking that term down a little bit, and I'm going to be referring to lepidosaurs. So again, not a popularly spread term, but something that more accurately refers to just lizards and snakes, which have a more closely shared lineage. And not only does that exclude turtles to begin with, not that we are against turtles in any way. Our wonderful western pond turtles, I trust, are being studied with respect to fire by other studies. But they don't happen to be a species that corresponds to our particular study methods. So in addition to not falling under the category of lepidosaurs, they just don't happen to be included in what we're going to be discussing today. So that's the target of our interest in this particular study. These groups are particularly interesting to us with respect to fire because we consider them to be potentially vulnerable based on a few physiological traits. First, well, and I'd like to say that all three of these traits are well illustrated through the lens of one particular local species, which is the California slender salamander, who you see pictured 3 times over here. The first trait that California slender salamanders are a good demonstration of is the limited vigility of these species. So vigility being the ability to disperse or to move over the landscape in response to environmental variables such as fire, right? So the ability to disperse and move away from fire is a tactic that many wildlife species employ with response to fire that can be pretty effective. You know, a multi-acre fire can be avoided by something like a deer or other sort of megafauna that are capable of moving out of the way of such an influence. Whereas in particular, if you take a look at these slender salamanders, particularly in the bottom picture, you can see they have these evolutionarily reduced limbs that really limit their capacity to move out of the way of nearly anything. They tend to have a very limited home ranges over the course of their lifetime tend to be less than 10 meters in diameter. So moving out of the way of a multi-acre burn is not likely to be a tactic that this group can employ. Additionally, especially for amphibians, the dependence on moist conditions due to the threat of desiccation or drying out is a concern, and dry conditions are certainly a result and a coupled idea with fire. So extremely dry, hot conditions and desiccation is another concern we would have for particularly amphibians with respect to fire. And then finally, all herpetofauna, most herpetofauna tend to have this trait called thigmotaxy, which is this idea, something I think that humans can relate to quite well. They tend to prefer situations where they have cover in which they are literally squeezed underneath habitat complexity. So whether that's rocks or logs, or as we will see today, plywood boards that have been placed on landscapes, they tend to prefer that cover. And because a consequence of fire can be the removal of a lot of habitat cover, the loss of that complexity can be a concern for creatures who seem to depend upon having habitat cover to sort of squeeze underneath and use as refuge, not only from predators, but also, again, from desiccation. It can be one of their tactics for remaining in moist conditions. So based on all those vulnerabilities, we would consider fire to be a potential threat to these populations. In addition to that, I'd like to highlight the value of these groups. So I always like to break value down into the components of both the inherent value as well as the functional value. So even as this very charming juvenile California king snake down at the bottom here can show you with its feisty tail twitching and rearing up at me, these creatures are not only charming, but they are, legitimate components of our local habitats, and they deserve their place in it. And in addition to sort of having that inherent value, I think a value that's really closely coupled to that idea is their educational value. So just by being, as I would say, quite charming and approachable as far as wildlife species are concerned, they have the capacity to provide really surprisingly intimate experiences for people of all ages who are interested in being inspired by nature. So any environmental educator can tell you that the ability to handle a snake or to go eye to eye with a newt or salamander can be a very inspiring experience for nearly anybody out in the wildlands. In addition to that, I'd like to discuss their more functional ecological value. So this is taken from a fairly recent study by Sanchez-Hernandez that investigated the value of salamanders as components of not only terrestrial but aquatic food webs, and how they can represent an integration of terrestrial and aquatic food webs, both as consumers of invertebrate species and as prey for vertebrate species in more terrestrial and aquatic systems. So they absolutely hold a place within our ecosystems, within our food webs, within these trophic relationships that is worth preserving. So when it comes to previous studies of how fire impacts herpetofauna of various taxa across the globe, we will find that our ecological understanding is dependent on context, right? Ecology almost always will tell you that the effects that any given stressor will have depends not only on the species, but on the habitat context, and in case of fire, it's very dependent on the frequency and intensity of that phenomena to see what the effect is going to be on a given population. So I'm going to show you just a brief chart that's going to summarize a lot of the information that I encountered in trying to understand our previous understandings here. So this is going to be broken down. You can see the first column is for lepidosaurs. So again, that's our the components of reptiles that are just our snakes and lizards, and then also for amphibians. And the studies that are associated with those, these happen to be just studies that investigated both of those taxa in whatever given system they were investigating. And what I really want you to take away from this is that there was a mixed bag of responses based on the different study systems that they were looking at, the fire regimes that were involved in affecting these species. So you can see, in particular, I'd like you to take a look at the very first row, which is Russell et al. 1999, which was a wonderful meta-analysis that summarized a lot of the information that had come in previous to 1999. And the summary that they took away from that meta-analysis is that because fire tends to facilitate beneficial habitat, it tends to have an indirect benefit on herpetofauna in general. So that was their sort of bird's eye view of the previous understanding of it. Since then, you'll see the following rows showed a kind of, again, a bit of a mixed bag. So several studies showed just negligible impacts to both groups. There were some positive impacts to lepidosaurs, sitting next to either no impact or distinct negative impacts to amphibians. And then we saw some cases where we had negative impacts to the lepidosaurs, and then again, even within the amphibians, sort of a mixed bag. And what I just want to have taken away from that is that it was really variable based on the species, based on the habitat context, and then what fire intensity and frequency they were faced with. And then looking at some more recent studies just to highlight some more specific results. There is the case of the southern knob-tailed gecko, which is a southern Australian species. Smith in 2018 and some of Smith's following studies has actually identified this species as almost a fire specialist. They tend to demonstrate increased abundance following a fire event within the few years following, and they have identified that as a response to increased invertebrate prey availability following a fire event, which is something that has been observed. Certain species of invertebrates like grasshoppers, especially highly vagal species, will tend to preferentially inhabit post-fire areas. So they summarize that because of this influx of invertebrate prey species, this particular gecko will tend to have a population boost or a fitness boost based on that response. And then on the flip side of that, Santos and Chilean in 2013 found that their lepidus, or actually their full reptile community in the Mediterranean areas of France tended to show overall decreases in diversity, and particularly threats to the already endangered Hermann's tortoise. So again, depending on the species, depending on the site, and depending on a number of other factors that might be difficult to even summarize, you just cannot necessarily predict a given system's response until you investigate it in particular. And so that was one of the reasons why this study that I'm about to describe is useful, because we need to investigate our particular local responses for our particular local species to fire events before we can really make any management decisions about how we can predict future fires to affect them. And finally, with that, when we're talking about predicting future fires, we're not just thinking about the increase of wildfires and any management actions we may need to take with respect to that, but we also are very interested as a community in introducing prescribed fire as a method of mitigating wildfires. Just as a brief overview of that idea, here you can see that prescribed fires are this practice that's been practiced for truly thousands of years by humans, and with a rather startling gap in our history, starting about 200 years ago, where we have switched to fire suppression as a practice. But you can see some more recently integrated prescribed fire as part of a land management protocol. One thing I'd like to just point out, you can see on this left this prescribed burn that was done at Cooley Ranch as part of the Good Fire Alliance, and I think with assistance from Fire Forward program from El Run Canyon Ranch. The intensity of fire is extremely different when it comes to a prescribed fire. The target for a prescribed controlled burn is to burn very low with low intensity, and that is going to be a very different kind of fire from a wildfire event. At the same time, there are chances for wildfire events to behave as a proxy. Wildfire events vary with respect to intensity, and we're going to take a look at how the particular fire event that we experienced as part of this study may actually be a reasonably useful proxy for predicting how even a prescribed burn might affect the species that we're interested in here. So let's get into the particular study that we are going to be discussing today. Unsurprisingly, hopefully, this was a study that was conducted at Pepperwood Preserve. So that's in Sonoma County, and that is hosting a Mediterranean climate. So that is a particular of particular interest to us, especially with respect to Pepperwood is host to a number of habitat types, including both oak woodlands and grasslands, and those are going to be the two habitats we're most interested in today. The grasslands of Mediterranean climates in California, and then mixed oak and hardwood woodlands are going to be the two that we're looking at. Within Pepperwood itself, the two study sites we're looking at are based around seasonal ponds. Both of these ponds change distinctly over the course of the year, wet season versus dry season, but they are both located within the boundaries of Pepperwood here, as you can see. And at each pond, we collected data using coverboard transects, so plywood coverboards about a half of an inch thick. Each coverboard measures 4 feet by 2 feet, and have been placed with respect to these ponds in 6 transects each. 3 transects are located distinctly within grassland habitat, and 3 transects distinctly within mixed oak hardwood forests, giving us some insight as to different how different species might inhabit or prefer one habitat or another, and then with some variability in terms of distance from pond. So they are each transect is 5 meters apart from the other transects radiating out from the pond sites, and then in rough lines, rough transect lines beginning at the pond, and then each 10 meters a new coverboard is placed. And I'm going to discuss how that came to be. The study was established in 2014 by Julie Whitman. You can see pictured at the top left here. And she created this study with a very specific tactic of wanting to investigate how iNaturalist and citizen scientist data can be compared to more traditional data collection by experts in the field. So with that in mind, she created these sort of generalizable transects that I just described to you around these pond sites, and with help from some very willing volunteers, you can see here, created these coverboard arrays, and then as part of her project, trained a number of citizen scientist volunteers to accompany expert observers in the field. So you can see myself as an expert observer here, armed with the traditional arsenal of clipboards and pens and whatnot, partnered with one of our citizen scientists. And the goal of the study was that as citizen scientists collected abundance data, or rather observation data, of herpetofauna under cover boards in weekly surveys, the citizen scientists would be collecting that using their smartphone, and then the expert observer would be quietly taking the same data, again, using more traditional methods, just simple clipboard observation. And then Julie assessed that data, compared the whether or not the iNaturalist data matched, how well it matched the expert data collection method. She published a study there, as you can see. And so that was a wonderful project, but it created this opportunity where, although she only needed those coverboard arrays for 1 year of data collection, there was simply no reason not to continue collecting data to create a more long-term study. And that was exactly what happened. We continued surveying those same coverboards. And in this case, we no longer partnered ourselves with the citizen scientists. People were welcome to join us, but for the most part, we sent our experts out into the field to continue collecting biweekly data. So we had a number of wonderful expert observers. Here you can see Connor Simiotti, who was one of the first people to take up the torch and continue data collection. But Alex Moore, Jessica Torres, myself, all contributed data to the ongoing data collection. And I just wanted to highlight two of my absolute favorite moments of data collection out in the field. You can see here two species that I had never encountered before. I was never lucky enough to encounter until I observed them under cover boards. You can see a juvenile sharp-tailed snake who was kind enough to let me interact with him or her. And I also was able to observe my very first mature Pacific giant salamander under a cover board. It was a very rare sighting. We don't see them very often under cover boards, but we did have that one waiting there for me one morning during a coverboard survey. So the surveys continued unabated, in spite of the fact that we experienced the Tubbs wildfire 2 years after beginning data collection. So we had 2 years of data collection already underway and under our belts. And then in October, which happened to be in the gap in our data collection season lasts from December to July. In the October prior to our 3rd year of data collection, the Tubbs wildfire impacted the majority of Pepperwood's property and lasted for a few days. It did consume a few of our cover boards, but just as soon as we were able to reaccess the property, we returned, replaced any cover boards that needed replacing, and quickly, as soon as December rolled around, recommenced collecting data, now with the idea that we had 2 years of pre-fire data and could potentially collect a number of years of post-fire data. To just touch base on how the intensity of the fire affected our particular study sites. This is a fire intensity map. So the soil burn severity was estimated by Pepperwood. And you can see again, the location of our 2 study sites within Pepperwood took place where the fire appears to have been a combination of very low to low intensity. I find this particularly helpful because this means that the level of intensity that we saw from the Tubbs fire on these particular study sites mimics something close to what we would expect, not just from, the sort of random spread of a wildfire depending on the area, but also on what we would expect to see from a prescribed burn. So a relatively low intensity fire, a high intensity fire would not be something we'd be interested in necessarily with respect to predicting how prescribed burns would affect the landscape. But in this case, we might actually have the capability to generalize this to the way prescribed fire might affect herps as well. So again, there was a bit of a mosaic over the Pepperwood landscape, but despite the fact that although the fire intensity was low, both we could see very clearly that both Turtle Pond and Double Pond, our two study sites, were indeed touched by wildfire in particular. You can see this is Turtle Pond on the left here. This photo was taken by Michelle Halber almost immediately after the fire, as soon as staff was able to access it. And then Julie Whitman returned to Double Pond, the other study site, just a few weeks following the fire, and you can see that the grass is beginning to grow, but almost the entire grassland, and you can see the wooded area in the back was absolutely affected by this fire. So let's take a look at what we learned so far in by analyzing the 2 years preceding the Tubbs fire at these study sites in terms of these coverboard surveys, and then we're going to analyze the 2 years following. These 2 years in particular are useful because they followed the Tubbs fire, but they preceded the next set of wildfire that affected one, although not both of these study sites. So we decided to halt and take some analysis at this time after these 2 years post-fire, so that we could see what does one fire do to the behavior and particularly the rate of observation of this, the study species here. So we're going to look at three aspects of it. We're going to take a look at how the phenology, or the seasonal patterns of behavior. So phenology means literally the study of how things show. So how whether or not we see these organisms active above ground. We predicted that there would be seasonal patterns of whether or not they appear, observationally present in the system under these coverboards, based on basically the month of the year. And we would expect there to be some seasonal patterns of behavior based on their physiology. We were interested in confirming our understanding of their habitat use, their habitat preferences. So we expect certain species to be preferentially inhabiting certain, whether either the forest or the grassland, again, based on our understanding of them and their physiology and their habitat needs. And then finally, we will look at how wildfire impacted their diversity of these species within the habitat, and then taking a look at how those wildfire impacts changed the phenology and how they changed the habitat use of these species in the immediate post-fire years. So just to begin, let's take a look at who we observed out there. So this is a summary of those 4 years. 2016 and 2017 preceded the Tubbs fire. 2018 and 2019 are just the 2 post-fire years following the Tubbs fire. And you can see this is a summary, the first row being all species of herpetofauna. So the total tally of everybody who we observed either under or directly associated, so within 5 meters of coverboards during our surveys. And then the 6 most observed species. So you can see the total number of observations, that final column on the right tallies up the total number, and all of those are at least 200 observations over the course of these 4 years. Through power analysis, we discovered that that is really the minimum rate or total observation that it takes to be able to do robust statistical analyses of this of their observations and of their diversity. So I'm going to show you the rest of our community here. There were 10 additional species just within these 4 years that were observed, but all with less than 200 total observations. So not nearly enough to be able to analyze them, but all of the observations were included in the total herpetofauna. And as you can see, following these 4 years, there were additional species that were added to this list, but within the 4 years, it was just these 16 species total who were recorded under coverboards. Our top 6, these are the species that we were able to analyze their particular behavior. So we have just one Anoran, our Pacific chorus frog or Sierra tree frog, however you prefer to refer to them in terms of colloquial terms. Slender salamanders were our next most abundant, and California newts were abundant in these habitats. As far as our lepidosaurs go, we had western fence lizards, western skinks, and our southern alligator lizards. So all fairly common species in this area, and with somewhat distinct physiological traits and life histories that we're going to see played out in their not only their phenological patterns of behavior, but also their habitat use, and then some interesting highlights as to how they responded or how they behaved in the post-fire years. Quick note on how we measure diversity. So we did calculate how the diversity changed over the course of the months and of the years in the post-fire and pre-fire environments. So we calculated that by for every survey day, and again during these during the predicted high season of herps from December through July, we sampled at least every 2 weeks. So for each individual survey day of those biweekly surveys that we took, we grouped the observations into the study site. So again, we had 2 pond sites, so divided that up that way. And then even within the study sites, we divided into just the grassland cover boards and just the forest cover boards. So each of those 4 groupings, we calculated diversity using Shannon's diversity index, which is a fairly standard measure of diversity. We also calculated species richness, although it was so closely correlated with the Shannon's diversity index that I'm really just going to talk about the diversity index today. So we calculated that to see how the diversity of the species changed over the course of the season, and then also how it compared before and following the fire. So first, I'd like to just show you here what the phenological pattern was for all of the species combined. So when we looked at the rate of observations, the total rate of observations for all Herpetofauna species, we saw a pretty distinct pattern where early in the year, so especially in January, you see a peak of rate of observation for most of the species. And then by June and July, you see a distinct drop off. The least number of Herpetofauna species of any kind were present and active in the area by those hot summer months, which is predictable based on just the conditions involved. So by the time you get to June and July, you're seeing very dry conditions. So you would expect, especially the amphibians, to no longer be present in the area. They would be sheltering and finding a moist condition to maintain themselves. And then even your lepidosaur species, who are more resilient to desiccation, you know, in those extremely hot months, you're going to it's going to be more of a struggle to maintain body temperature as an endotherm and to regulate. So we would expect to see the least number of herps active in the seats in the area in June and July, and that is something that absolutely played out according to our hypotheses. And even the diversity within this of the community as a whole, it was a little bit more delayed because you sort of the diversity tops out at this very interesting confluence of conditions in February and March. That's going to be your highest diverse Herpetofauna array, because you still have amphibians somewhat present in the system following their peak in January, but then you're also, because the temperatures are beginning to warm, you're starting to see the lepidosaurs emerging and enjoying the warmth that they crave as endotherms. So you see this interesting confluence in those sort of early spring months as moist conditions continue and warm conditions begin to escalate. So that was the overall pattern, and that really shows that as we're looking forward, and I'm going to discuss this a little bit later, when it comes to either planning a prescribed burn or mitigating for wildfire concerns, if you are looking at a fire that's taking place beginning in June and sort of into the more established dry season, you'd expect to see the least impact on above ground Herpetofauna, because that's going to be their least active and least diverse time. When it comes to individual species, I'm not going to show you every single chart. I'm just going to summarize for you. We saw similar patterns for two of our amphibian species. Both the Sierran tree frogs and the California slender salamander had kind of closely tied phenological patterns, so their seasonal patterns seem to be a really distinct peak in January. Again, the wet season had begun in earnest, and then the rates drop very steeply as spring begins to show and the moisture of the conditions begins to dry out. And by the time May rolls around, you really don't see many of these organisms above ground. They're sheltering underground. Newts had a slightly distinct but very similar pattern with just a slightly earlier emergence. So we actually, by the time our study season began in December, they were already at their absolute peak of above ground abundance, as compared to both slender salamanders and Pacific chorus frogs. They have more resilience as lunged salamanders, so they don't depend entirely on gas exchange through their skin. Their cutaneous gas exchange is present, but they also happen to have lungs and are somewhat more mobile based on that. They're a little less dependent on moisture as they are moving toward their pond sites. They are moving from upland habitat where they spend most of their dry season, and they are moving as a group toward the pond site where they reproduce. So their reproductive cycle seems to precede the emergence of the other amphibians in this area by a month or so. So they seem to peak in December, and then they were difficult to observe in the area by April. So again, a similar, very distinct phenological pattern, but maybe just a little bit sooner than we had predicted. Moving on to the lizard species, since as far as lepidosaurs were concerned, the snakes were a little rarer, so we really were just observing lizards as far as being able to analyze species. We would say that the skinks had kind of a similar distinct phenological pattern, considered similar to the amphibians in that you could really see that they had one distinct window of above ground behavior. So their observations largely occurred from February to May, so a little bit later, maybe dependent on that sweet spot of temperature being warm enough to give these endotherms some energy, but not so warm that they would struggle to maintain their homeostasis in those extremely warm months. So we, like the amphibians, we really don't see them above ground very often in June and July. By the end of May, they seem to be a little bit less active above ground, and their peak really took place in April. On the other hand, our other two lizard species had less distinctive ties to their phenological patterns. They seem to kind of vary a little bit more by month in ways that weren't super clear to us. So there might have been another environmental factor sort of driving their above ground, but it was a really weak predictor. There was a significant response here, but for the most part, they seem to vary based on other ecological factors. So a little more variable for these two species. And in both cases, these would have been the species that we saw above ground in June and July, and they both seem to demonstrate more effective methods of thermoregulation in sort of those warm months. So maybe they are more capable of regulating themselves and taking advantage of any conditions that might benefit them in June and July. They can actually take advantage of environmental factors that are still active at that point. So to summarize, the summer months are absolutely the least active period. Very few exceptions. Most species are deep underground by June and July, and each of them had their own distinct seasonal pattern, just as we predicted. Moving on to habitat use, which is of particular interest to us since we're looking at these two distinctive habitats. We're looking at forests and we're looking at grasslands with respect to these pond sites. Previous knowledge, so just taken from a guidebook, the classic Stebbins guidebook tells us that the forests are going to be mostly inhabited by the plectodontid salamanders, so the lungless salamanders. That includes our California slenders and various other species. The newts we would expect to see mostly there. And then both the alligator lizards and then certain species of snakes like ringnecks we would expect to see in the forest, whereas grasslands would be the preferential habitat of the fence lizards, chorus frogs, skinks, so that's two of our lizard species, and certainly our neurons. And then most of our larger snakes would be expected to be found preferentially in the grasslands. Results were close to what we expected. So we did indeed find that both California slender salamanders and alligator lizards preferred forest habitats that were most commonly observed in forests. And in the grasslands, we found that fence lizards, western skinks, and Pacific chorus frogs were most abundant in those habitats, or most commonly observed in those habitats. But we actually found that California newts did not seem to demonstrate a preference. That might be based on the fact that we are examining them specifically with respect to a pond habitat, so with respect to their breeding grounds. So rather than really analyzing their landscape-wide preference for one habitat or another, we are seeing them on the move between their upland habitat and the pond site. And so based on that, they would be less predicted based on the habitat they're moving through than that just wouldn't affect them as much, because they sort of aren't concerned so much with the conditions of the habitat through which they are migrating. They're just more interested in what is the most direct line between my upland habitat and the breeding site that I'm headed for. So they didn't seem to show a preference. It's interesting that they seem to have upland habitat sites as likely to be, across a grassland as across a forest. That did not seem to be a major predictor for them. Right, and then finally getting into wildfire impact. All right, so let's talk about what we saw when we compared the pre and the post-fire rates of observation. So when it came to rates of observation, two species showed significant decreases. Now, I want to say up front here, I haven't demonstrated this. The overall herpetofauna rates of observations were not significantly affected. Neither was the diversity. So we're going to be looking at individual species responses, but we found that the total population did not decrease in either rate of observation or in diversity following the fire. So that's a significant thing to start off with to begin with. But looking at the individual species, you'll see how it kind of generalized across total community, but that might be based on sort of a myriad of effects of individual species. We can see here that the slender salamanders, they had the most significantly decreased rate of observations following the fire. California newts also showed some decrease, but you can see I've demonstrated the sort of the statistical values associated with these analyses, and you can see that the p-value, so which is kind of the gauge of how significant this impact appeared to be, was actually what we'd call marginal. So 0.05 is kind of on the edge of what we as scientists would consider to be a significant result. So, and then indeed, the F value can be considered to be a measure of how strong a predictor this was of the data we saw. And a 3 is low on the side. You can see that, especially compared if we come across here to some of the increases. You can see an F value of 24. So this was a relatively weak predictor. So wildfire was a relatively weak predictor of rate of observation, and it was significant, but only just as far as our judgment is concerned for statistical analysis. So there was, pretty substantial, this very low p-value for our California slender salamanders, a little bit less of a strong predictor, but still a significant decrease for both these species. Um, we saw 3 of our species demonstrate increased abundance following the fire, and that's very interesting. I'd like to remind you that, there was that study from Smith in Southern Australia that showed that geckos appeared to have increased fitness in a post-fire environment, possibly driven by invertebrate responses. Of course, we did not measure invertebrate responses. We were only one piece of sort of the measurement puzzle, but it would be interesting to see if some of these increases were the result of sort of this trophic response, if we had increased invertebrates in these post-fire habitats that may have driven this effect we see here, where in particular the southern alligator lizards seem to show a very distinct increase in rate of observation following the Tubbs fire. And finally, our one last, with that, I'd like to briefly discuss the fact that between the 2 habitats, we saw the most observable impacts to habitat structure in the forest. So you can see in this pre-fire forest area, lots and lots of leaf litter on the ground. You can see that there's woody debris, underneath all of these trees from fallen limbs, all of which would be considered to be valuable habitat structure for herpetofauna, these ground-dwelling vertebrates. Whereas in post-fire, the ground was largely bare, and leaf litter probably was the first thing to sort of re-inhabit these structural components of this system, whereas fallen limbs are going to take a little bit longer to be resupplied compared to a grassland where the grass itself is providing the cover, and that springs back relatively quickly following a fire just in that first season. So looking at that pre and post fire structural change, although we did not do rigorous data collection and analysis, we could observe that there were very distinct differences. So going back to looking at these decreases, we can see that both the slender salamander is a forest dweller, preferential forest dweller, and that the newts had no preference, so they inhabited the forest at least as much as they inhabited the grassland. So these were both possibly be subject to these changes in habitat structure in the forest. On the other side, right, we saw increases in the Pacific chorus frog and the fence lizards, so they would not have been subject to the forest necessarily. However, it does kind of leave this hanging idea of this forest dweller, the southern alligator lizard, absolutely preferred forests overall, but did not seem to show that same decrease. In fact, if anything, showed a significant increase in their population. So we'll investigate other things that may have contributed that distinction between how these forest dwellers responded compared to the southern alligator lizard. Taking a look at one final species, we did see no change in the skinks. Now, skinks, these are, again, preferential grassland dwellers. So, again, sort of an exception we're looking at. We're looking at a grassland dweller who, unlike their 2 grassland patriots here, who showed increases, skinks, if we can say that the increases in the other lizard populations may have been based on a condition, let's say invertebrate prey species abundance in the grassland, these skinks seem to have missed the boat. They didn't lose any ground in terms of perceived abundance, but they did not seem to benefit from whatever was influencing the other lizard species. And for that, I took a look again at this. This is the phenological pattern that we saw from these skinks. So I referred to it earlier. You can see it displayed here, that they have this extremely tight set of months in which they appear to be active above ground. Whereas I think I remember saying that the lizard species, the other 2 lizard species, so that's the alligator lizards and the fence lizards, remained more abundant and or active above ground through these summer months. So it's possible that whatever was taking place in the grassland that boosted the fitness of the other two lizard species may have been dependent on sort of these later months where the western skink was no longer able to cope with the temperature changes, no longer able to thermoregulate in that season, and therefore may have missed the boat on whatever late spring and early summer conditions may have boosted the fitness of the other two lizard species. And finally, I would like to take a look at, again, we had this sort of hanging idea of, well, there might be something going on in the grassland that is beneficial, but how on earth did the southern alligator lizards, who were overall forest dwellers, take advantage of that? Well, if we break down their habitat preference by before the fire and after the fire, we'll actually see that you can see this pre-fire preference spelled out here on the left. Before the fire, that preference was extremely distinct for these southern alligator lizards, right? You can see that in these pre-fire years, they were just, I don't want to use the term exponential, but they were wildly more likely to be observed in the forest compared to the grassland. And then if you look at just the post-fire years, you can see that they were just as likely to be found in each habitat. So whether that's a result of these alligator lizards perceiving better conditions in the grasslands and dispersing themselves into grassland habitat in these post-fire years, it's possible. It's also possible that because you saw that, they did not decrease in rate of observation in the forest, it could just be that these populations did extraordinarily well in this immediate post-fire year. They appear to be very active above ground and seem to be enjoying really increased rates of observation in both of these two habitats. So perhaps the reason why, even though they are not grassland dwellers, they seem to benefit from something that may have been happening in the grassland in these post-fire years, based on the fact that they suddenly did not prefer one habitat or the other. They were just as likely to take advantage of anything that might have been happening in that grassland. Finally, one last thing that we observed, it was a very small but distinctly significant result of the wildfire. I've made these nice and small because I'm not going to dive into them each individually, but we did find that there was a slight change for almost all the species, everything except, I believe, the California newts did not seem to be affected by this. The seasonal pattern of observation seemed to be altered slightly for almost all species following the fire. So there isn't a clear reason why these phenological changes took place. There would probably be a distinctive story for each one. It did not seem, again, like a very strong predictor. You can see that although these are all significant values in terms of their p-values, the f-values are pretty small, so it's not a strong predictor of observation over the course of the seasons, but it is significant. So it might be worth just taking note that the seasonal behavior of most of these species seems to change a little bit. That may not have huge ecological impacts following one fire, as you see here, but it's possible that that would create vulnerabilities to additional fires or additional changes in other environmental concerns. So it's worth noting that the incidence of a fire in sort of the quiet, less active season does seem to make a change in how these animals inhabit the landscape and how they behave in the immediate post-fire years. So something to watch out for as we see multiplicative effects of other influences on them. I want to just summarize all of that. I want to say, again, reinforce, there was no significant decrease in either the total herpetofauna rate of observation or in their diversity in response to the Tubbs fire. So that was our biggest concern. That's how I've framed it in terms of not being a decrease. You can also just say there were no significant impacts. I was not concerned necessarily that there would be wild population explosions. I was most concerned that there would be detrimental effects, and that does not seem to have taken place. There were changes in abundance following the Tubbs fire, and that varied by species in pretty distinct ways. And southern alligator lizards demonstrated a very interesting shift in the way they inhabited the landscape. So they appeared to lose their preferences and possibly be responding to something interesting happening in the grassland following the Tubbs fire. Then nearly all of the species, California newt accepted, demonstrated a change in their behavioral patterns. And again, looking sort of at the California newt in terms of their physiological preferences and their life history, because they really are inhabiting this area, you know, purely for the sake of moving through to get to a pond site. It makes sense biologically that they would not necessarily have a lot of response to changes in the conditions because they're just trying to get through there to get to their pond site. So it's merely a path to them, not necessarily a destination, the areas that we're looking at. Management considerations that result from these sort of general responses, we would expect, based on the phenological patterns that we saw, that prescribed fire within certain time periods, in particular, we're looking at June and July, since we saw hard data that is truly the least active, least diverse time above ground for herpetofauna, that prescribed fires during that time would be the least likely to impact herpetofauna species above ground. We can also possibly generalize that, I should say, sorry, with the exception of California slender salamanders. Now, they are a very, very abundant species. They're among our most abundant. I believe they constituted 1/3 of the total observations. So in this particular area, I would not consider them to be a species under threat. So it's possible that, you know, although it's very important to note that they might be the most impacted by fires at any given time, they are not currently threatened species. So that's something to consider. Again, prescribed fires in those dry summer months would be the least threatening. And going back to the first point, again, we can predict that summer months, because we have hard data on that phenological time period, would be least impactful. The response that we're looking at happened to be to an October fire. So I would extend that June and July dry summer months time to include the certain time period of maybe June and July extended into October, since that functionally in the landscape, it remains a similar season, right? We're looking at the extension of those dry summer months into early fall, prior to the advent of the rains, when we really see a phenological change in behavior for these animals, although it would be really valuable to collect data in a larger time frame so that we can really feel more confident about that. So yes, in other words, this October fire did not seem to have an overall detrimental impact to this group. In future, what we'd like to look for is continue monitoring these sites in particular. No reason not to. Again, it's a great ongoing project that's being, the torch is sort of being passed from one person to another. We can continue collecting this data. But we can also extend that data collection season at the very least to begin earlier, so that we might be able to capture sort of the beginning of the active season for the newts in particular, who are already at their peak in the very beginning of our survey season. Some questions that this really brought up for us is there indeed this invertebrate prey species influx in this, particularly in the grassland areas following a fire in this study system, because that might answer the question of how these grassland species, and in the case of the alligator lizard, this post-fire grassland species, really seem to enjoy increased fitness. And then we would also like to have a better understanding of how the habitat structure, particularly in the forest, did respond to a fire. Again, we had general observations that we saw a major change in that, but rigorous and statistically valid information on that would be really valuable to understand why these dynamics took place. And finally, I would just like to thank so many people who contributed to this study. You can see some wonderful funding came in from the Waters Collaborative, Clover Stornetta of Sonoma, the Ellen Masland Saylor Scholarship, all of which can financially supported my work here in particular. Pepperwood is a wonderful host site. Michelle Halber in particular, I would like to say thank you to, and Tom Greco for, as you saw, contributing some of the photographs. And then as far as individuals are concerned, my thesis committee, which is Derek Gurman as the head of my thesis committee, and then Tasha Commandant and Dan Crocker, who are also part of that, and Julie Whitman, who established this project and supported me in that way. A number of the other expert observers who collected data, and that includes many of the volunteers, including George Jackson. I already shouted out to Connor Simiotti and Alex Moore, another major contributor of data. And I'd like to thank you all for being here. And if you're interested in following up with more information, my references are available here.